Good morning, everyone. My name is Corey Walker. I'm Dean of the Wake Forest University School of Divinity and the Wake Forest Professor of the Humanities, and I want to welcome you to today's 2024 Environmental and Epistemic Justice Summit, sponsored by the Mellon Foundation's Initiative on Environmental and Epistemic Justice here at Wake Forest University. In the summer of 1978, Robert Burns and his two sons were hired to dispose of toxic soil. Burns and his sons dumped the toxic soil laced with PCBs along 240 miles of North Carolina state highways. The event gained national attention, coming just days before another toxic event would capture the nation's attention at Love Canal. The state purchased the land from hard-on-their-luck Warren County farmers facing foreclosure and bankruptcy in a process that was anything but transparent and fair. It galvanized a community who fought for over 3 years in court against the state's actions. The community struggle linked grassroots organizations with national organizations, affecting a radical change in collective identity and movement strategy. While formalized in the iconic Toxic Waste and Race Report issued by the United Church of Christ Commission on Racial Justice, the environmental justice movement drew on the deep wells of the Black freedom struggle and the knowledges, actions, and righteous anger of a community committed to the inherent dignity of the right to live a human life. On the evening of January 31st, 2022, close to 600 tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer caught fire at the Weaver Company in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. The fire presented a historic and unprecedented danger to the surrounding community, including parts of the Wake Forest University campus. However, the Wake Forest community's composition stands in stark contrast to the community in immediate proximity to the Weaver Company. The community immediately surrounding the Weaver plant is composed of over 80% citizens of color, with approximately 40% living at or below the poverty level. By contrast, Wake Forest University is an elite university where over 60% of the student body is white, and the student family median income ranks among the top 20 in the nation. The Weaver fertilizer fire brought into sharp relief the deeply divergent lives and life chances of two communities, one predominantly white and well-resourced, and one predominantly black and brown and precarious. The racial regimes governing these two communities are not only inscribed in the norms and mores organizing social, cultural, and political and economic life, but also in the very conditions of life and the organizations of knowledge that structures and forms each community and their histories. While North Carolina claims to be the home of the environmental justice movement, the Weaver fertilizer fire exposed the historic and ongoing legacies of race, racism, and environmental injustice. Warren County and the Weaver fire are two instances of disaster by design, the infinite and unconscious ways in which racial regimes are naturalized and inscribed in the environment. All too often, knowledge of these conditions remains more descriptive and reflective rather than critical and analytical. Consequently, our general and common sense understanding of the environment, race, and processes of racialization and injustice are naturalized and placed beyond critical and sustained interrogation. Close to 70 years ago, a group of scientists, led by the gifted scientist and humanist Albert Einstein, issued a manifesto as a result of the tragic situation which confronts humanity, as a result of the dawn of the nuclear age. In that July 9, 1955 statement, widely known as the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, the signatories declared, "We have to learn to think in a new way." We have to learn to think in a new way in order to meet the manifest challenges of our age. Living in the wake of our nuclear war and in the midst of the climate catastrophe that is upon us, today's summit is designed so that we may follow up on that declaration and learn to think in a new way in building a more just and sustainable future for all of life across the planet. I'm honored that you joined us today for this inaugural summit. It is one of many gatherings that are being convened by this Mellon Initiative here at Wake Forest that is designed to enable us to think in a new way. I'd like to welcome my colleague, Melba Newsom, who's an award-winning independent journalist with over 2 decades of experience contributing investigative education, health, and environmental features to regional and national publications. She's a 2-time Pulitzer Center Fellow and the 2023 Alicia Patterson Fellow at the Pulitzer Center. Melba will provide us with an overview of today's summit and will lead us into our first panel. Thank you, Melba, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Walker, and thank you all for coming. We're really pleased that you're here. The panels start today. Each panel will run an hour, so our panelists are trickling in as they need to be here, and our guests are free to come and go as they please. But we have a great program here to talk about the work of that we are doing as part of the Mellon grant that we've received. And in addition to it, I run or started a fellowship program for journalists, particularly environmental journalists of color, trying to widen the pipeline of the people who do the reporting and tell these stories, because it's really critical to have people from those communities, from environmental justice communities, to talk about environmental justice so that we don't end up just parachuting in and telling the stories. But before we do that, it's that we have a set of panels today. The first one is environmental justice and the law, and next we will have environmental justice in the academy, and after lunch, environment and health, and environmental justice activism, and finally environmental justice journalism, followed by our keynote speakers. We were able to get great people to come and speak to us because they realize how people who have been on the front lines of environmental justice for decades, including Dr. Jalone White Newsom. We're not related, but I'm glad we share the same last name, from the Biden administration, and she's the federal chief environmental justice officer. And they were really excited to come and let us know what this administration has been doing, how forward-leaning they are and on environmental justice, and one of the most, I guess, active administrations to protect the environment. And of course we needed that after so many things got rolled back from the prior administration. And we have Peggy Shepard, who she's the co-founder and executive director of WEAC. They will be our keynote speakers at the end of the day. WEAC was one of the first environmental justice organizations formed in the country, and so she's been at this for like several decades. And they'll talk to us about their experience and kind of where all of this falls, including our work in promoting and just taking environmental justice from a footnote to the headlines, and that's where we'll start. We'll talk about, so I'd ask our first panelist to come up, and Scott Schlang, he's the director of the Wake Forest Environmental Law and Policy Clinic, and our panelist, and he will introduce everyone, and we'll get started this morning.
So we're really lucky to have a really wonderful panel of folks to talk with you today about environmental justice and the law, and hopefully it's not a depressing conversation. We're going to try to make sure we highlight those possibilities, because I do think the law has been frustrating on this topic for many years, but you have very devoted folks in front of you who've been working at this and finding new and inventive ways to come at it. And so hopefully we can learn some things today. On my immediate right is Veronica Bidding. She's a community advocate with a long history as a nonprofit manager, trainer, and community development practitioner. She's a Winston-Salem native from a storied family, which I hope she'll tell us some about. Her work has ranged from community organizer to grant writer, empathetic leader, and capacity builder. She's been a financial capability counselor at Neighbor Works America, an environmental justice fellow at the US EPA, and serves on several national and local boards, including the National Rural Housing Coalition, the Citizen Science Association, and the Winston-Salem Foundation's Black Philanthropy Initiative, and she's chair of the Environmental Justice Practitioners Network. And next to Veronica is Will Hendrick. Will is a new person to Winston-Salem. He and his family have moved here recently. He serves as the Environmental Justice Director of the North Carolina Conservation Network, a statewide network of over 60 environmental, community, and environmental justice organizations focused on protecting North Carolina's environment and public health. He's worked as a lawyer in the North Carolina Department of Environment and Natural Resources and the North Carolina Department of Justice. He's represented environmental nonprofits in state and federal courts while working at the Southern Environmental Law Center and Waterkeeper Alliance. And then we have Jasmine Washington as well. She's a Glen Key Associate Attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center, which is the largest nonprofit environmental legal advocacy organization rooted in and focused on the South. Jasmine focuses on environmental justice, industrial animal agriculture, and wood pellet biomass. She works on a number of cases involving Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and has done extensive research on the role of cumulative impacts in civil rights and environmental law. She's a lifelong resident of North Carolina, except for a 2-year stint in the Peace Corps in Paraguay. So thank you all for being here with us today. We would like to have this be somewhat conversational, so if at any time you have a question or comment, please raise your hand and we'll include you. I think there's a mic down here that we can use to make sure your question's captured. But to get us started, Veronica, you're an environmental justice advocate and Winston-Salem native. How would you describe to someone what environmental justice or environmental racism are and how they manifest in places like Winston-Salem?
Thank you so much, Scott, and thank you all for being here. Actually, I will start by quoting the US EPA's definition of environmental justice. They defined it as the just treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of income, race, color, national origin, tribal affiliation, or disability. In all agency decision making and other federal activities that affect human health and the environment so that people are fully protected from disproportionate and adverse human health and environmental effects and have equitable access to healthy, sustainable, and resilient environment in which to live, play, work, learn, grow, worship, and engage in cultural and subsistence practices. Actually, from a community standpoint, I would say that environmental justice is the intentional, deliberate, and disproportionate, or opposite of disproportionate, pollution of the air, water, and soil, and that addressing those disproportionate acts is actually just. And environmental justice, to me, and most people who experience the injustices, is considered more so than ever environmental racism, because it disproportionately affects people who look like me, live like me, and who are actually somewhat victimized, I don't like to use that word, by poor soil, air, and water quality. And as brief as I can make this, I would like to, as an example, Dr. Corey D.B. Walker has already basically described the Weaver fertilizer fire plant, the explosion actually. It was more than just a fire. It started with an explosion known to our local leadership. That's environmental injustice. It disproportionately affected low-wage earners, widows, and persons who did not have the means to mitigate all of the damage that was done on that day. Smith Dry Cleaners on Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, just about 1 mile north of Winston-Salem State University, my alma mater. The untreated and undiagnosed radon in homes in northeast Winston, and other parts of the city also, but I'm talking about injustices. Reynolds Forest Drive, and I'll elaborate a little more on that, but for the sake of time, I will just basically mention the cancer diagnosis of persons who live just 1 mile east of Bowman Gray Stadium, where they're treating methane for methane gas. You all know the effects of methane gas, I think, and how that was formerly, in the 40s and 50s, a landfill, a dump. And the university expanded that way. The stadium is right there. You all know what Winston-Salem State University's homecomings look like, right? And who's there. I can talk a little more later about Old Salem, across the creek from Salem, where my great-great-grandfather was the first of 10 freed slaves to be sold land by the Moravians at Old Salem. And what happened in that process, and what led to the naming of a footbridge in my grandfather's honor. And finally, just the overall lack of mitigation and remediation of other catastrophes. We'll talk more about that, but I will allow others to speak on this panel.
Thank you, Veronica. That was a wonderful introduction, and a wonderful, I mean, much more real introduction than the definition EPA gives us, which is kind of a sanitized version of what's really happening. Well, what are the federal legal responses to take on the issues that Veronica has outlined? Certainly the federal government is powerful and able to step into the breach.
Certainly, and I want to thank you for that question and for the organizers for setting this panel up and this summit up to explore these issues. I'll not attempt to summarize the entire 40-year plus history of response to environmental injustice by the federal government, but I do want to emphasize it's predominantly been a response from the executive branch. Courts, honestly, have blunted some of the available tools. The Congress has not, despite repeated introduction of bills to address specifically and systemically environmental injustice, has not acted in that way, certainly not until very recently. I'll get to that in a moment. But within the executive, I would also note it is not a response solely from the Environmental Agency. Although the Environmental Protection Agency has taken a number of meaningful steps, I think it's important to acknowledge that environmental injustice is not the result of a single agency's decision or a responsibility of a single agency to address. And so I think one of the most notable responses from the federal government was President Clinton's Executive Order 12898, which responded to the need for action and did a number of things, notably including the direction to all cabinet agencies to develop policies, the creation of some internal infrastructure. And I want to jump off from that sort of observation of the role of the chief executive to note kind of 4 different ways that the federal government has responded. This is painting with a pretty broad brush, but I know we're not going to be here all day on this panel. So I want to note one of the ways that the federal government has responded is through the collection, pursuit, and presentation of information. Some of the research, including building off of the seminal toxic waste and race study, to acknowledge the problem. And also, though, some of the more emerging efforts to visualize that data through the use of GIS tools. That research effort, including at the Office of Research and Development, to better understand the lived experience of those in communities like Veronica was noting. But in addition to that information pursuit, there's also been a lot of internal organizational infrastructure developed. Interagency collaboration, an invigoration of the Council on Environmental Quality, and actually at EPA, the development initially of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, more recently elevating that from out of EPA, as I noted earlier, to a whole of government effort in the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. The appointment of environmental justice leads at different agencies. So that infrastructure, both to ensure interagency collaboration and to facilitate input from impacted communities to inform those actions. In addition to sort of information and infrastructure, I'll call it interpretation, just for the sake of alliteration. In interpretation, what I mean to say is that in light of congressional inaction, much of the federal response has been recognizing and utilizing the tools that were already there, tools that preceded the birth of the environmental justice movement. Notably, as Jasmine is very familiar with, the Civil Rights Act, right, enacted in 1964, but also things like the National Environmental Policy Act, which have been on the books since 1970, and other laws that obligate agencies to prevent some of this injustice that we see, prevent recipients of federal funding, for instance, from acting in ways that confer or cause these disproportionate impacts. And I think one of the ways that was evident is when President Clinton took that action, I noted, there was actually an accompanying presidential memorandum basically saying, here are all these authorities we already had. And I think that is one thing, a theme that we see, is often the existence of law is insufficient. It's the application and enforcement of laws that are really necessary to advance the ball. And then more recently, one more investment. I think we've seen, especially in the Biden administration, and most notably through the American Rescue Plan Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the Inflation Reduction Act, intentional investment to address these disparities, to enable the work of community organizations to continue. And that's not the only effort. I mean, there have been collaborative problem-solving grants and other investments in the movement, but I think it's indisputable that over the last 4 years, we've seen the most intentional direction of resources to disadvantaged communities in our history as a response to environmental injustice. So those are some of the responses of the federal government, and I think a little bit later we'll talk about how belated but similar in approach we have seen some state executive action towards similar end.
Thanks, Will. Jasmine, you have to use these tools, and you're an environmental justice warrior in the courts. Can you help us understand a little bit about what the tools are you have to use and how SELC comes at environmental justice as an environmental law firm?
Sure. And good morning, everyone. Thank y'all for being out so bright and early this morning to hear us talk. To Will's point, one thing that I kind of always like to highlight up top is that unlike other areas of environmental practice, there is no environmental justice law. You know, we have like the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. We don't have like the Environmental Justice Act. And so, a lot of environmental justice related litigation or sort of courtroom activities involve using those traditional environmental law statutes, but with the intention of addressing an environmental injustice. And so, at SELC, that looks like making sure that our clients and partners kind of represent and look like the region that SCLC practices in. So we're present across 6 states in the Southeast. I'm in our North Carolina office. I'm licensed to practice in North Carolina, so most of my practice and work has been here in North Carolina. And so, without an environmental justice statute that allows you to bring action in court, we still we turn to traditional environmental laws. And so, challenging permits on behalf of environmental justice communities, once again, under the traditional environmental permitting practices. I know Will touched on Title VI, and that's a law that I think a lot of people see as an environmental justice law. And it can be used to advance environmental justice law, but that law and the regulations in and of themselves are not necessarily environmental justice laws. Title VI prohibits any organization, group, or individual that receives federal funding from acting in a way that causes discrimination based on race, color, national origin, or sex. Back in 2001, the Supreme Court said that you could not bring cases of disparate impact discrimination in federal court. So disparate impact exists under Title VI regulations, which most federal agencies have enacted very similar looking regulations for Title VI. And what those regulations say is that if you receive federal funds, you can't act in a way, regardless of intent, that causes a disproportionate impact based on color. And so in 2001, to Will's earlier point about sort of, courts and federal actors stepping in to kind of blunt some of the tools we have, they said that those claims of disparate impact can't be brought in court. So in order to bring those types of actions, we work outside of the court system. So those are complaints that are filed with the federal agency that gave the funding. So oftentimes, at least in my practice, that looks like filing claims against, or filing claims with EPA. So you basically, write a letter to EPA saying, you gave money to this group over here, and they did this action, and that action has caused a disproportionate adverse harm to a community of color. Because that is not something that is enforceable by a court, your remedies that you get from that are, not to keep using the same word, but a little blunted. You can't necessarily get those big sweeping victories that you could in the courtroom. I like to think of, this is not my analogy, I got it from somebody else years ago, except for I don't remember who it was, so I can't give them credit. But litigation is like a hammer, and so it is a very strong tool, but it is also very limited in scope and precise. Like you are hitting like one nail on the head. And with Title VI no longer, being, or without, Title VI is still applicable in federal courts, just not disparate impact. You can still bring claims of intentional discrimination. That is a very important fact. But without being able to use it, disparate impact as the hammer, we're kind of limited in a lot of the impact that we can get using Title VI. And so it is still what I like to see as a tool in the toolkit to advance environmental justice, but it is not sort of the all-inclusive tool that a lot of us wish that it were. Also, I'm not to bring things down, but there are very blatant, firm attacks against Title VI right now in disparate impact. There are, especially for anyone who hasn't read the affirmative action case that came down from the Supreme Court last year, Justice Gorsuch wrote an entire concurrence saying that he would have struck down affirmative action based on Title VI. And so, kind of reading that concurrence, if you just want a nice, good nighttime read, I suggest that one. It kind of laid out the path that somebody could take and the very clear arguments that somebody could use to basically dismantle Title VI. And just last week, was it last week? Just last week, the Attorney General from Florida, with a team of, I think it's 22 or 23 other attorneys generals from across the country, actually filed a petition for rulemaking to had the entire disparate impact regulations struck down from EPA's regulations. And so that's sort of a part of a larger trend that we're seeing at efforts to dismantle anything that kind of gets at environmental justice or any kind of race-conscious action. And, in environmental justice work, you can't really do that without race consciousness. To Veronica's point earlier, environmental racism is at the heart of environmental injustice. And so, if you kind of, yes, obviously income and low wealth communities are also in that mix, and that can happen regardless of race. But, without being able to acknowledge that, hey, 50 or 100 years ago, these polluting sites were intentionally placed in communities of color, and a lot of those sites are now starting to leak, they're starting to fall apart, they need repairs. I think the Woodson Weaver, explosion was a perfect example of that. A facility that got in before a lot of environmental regulations kicked in and has just been allowed to exist as it existed in this community of color for decades. And so, without being able to, look at race as what put those things there, it's hard to kind of get at, not impossible, we are working on it. So I do not want to discourage people or let them think that we are not gonna, fight to prevent this from happening. But reality is, without recognizing race, it's really hard to get at the heart of why these injustices exist and what can be done about them.
Thank you, Jasmine. That was helpful. So, Veronica, you've heard the legal advocates tell you, something you already knew, that you've heard and worked with for decades, that their tools are blunted and not really up to the task. So what do you do in the face of that? Are there other things you bring to the table, things like community health assessments? How do you operate in this legal environment?
Well, Scott, thank you for the question, and thank you so much, of course, my friend. But one thing is for certain, Jasmine is a very caring, very knowledgeable, well-equipped attorney. And so is her partner and senior attorney, Chandra Taylor Sawyer, who I actually adore, who's done a lot of work with me in various communities and neighborhoods in and outside of Winston-Salem, Forsyth County. But one thing is for certain, what she said made a lot of sense to me, to most of you in the audience. But if you go out into various communities where the impacts are very, extremely, let's say, great, they would not interpret what she said the same way that we did right here in this room. One of the greatest fallacies is that most of the federal, local, state laws are written in a way that's not even interpretable by people most impacted. Now, I really struggle with that because, again, I worked in Royal Oaks in Brunswick County with the formerly black farmers who were not even afforded, paid the same rate of taxes, but not afforded municipal water, and was drinking very dirty water, dying early, premature death. I worked with students at Winston-Salem State University where students were dying of cancer, young students, right out of college, and I don't have the exact statistics, but I've worked with, attended funerals. Nobody's talked about the methane gas treatment at Bowman Gray Stadium. Filing Title VI complaints is just that, it's a filing. Some of them lay on desks for years. What about the health disparities? What about the people who are sick, who are dying daily? What about, there are just a lot of things. I know, of course, Dr. Jacoby Wilson at University of Maryland at College Park. He's done some things locally. They've provided testers, but even interpreting the data of the tests for the air quality at the homes of people in very low income housing, it is actually not really gone very far. And even when that statistical data is documented, nobody treats it. Now, and I'm going to be totally honest, what I've seen, my 30 or so years out here, is that when there is sufficient treatment, guess what? It's gentrification also. The people are moved away from those homes. They're taxed from, at a rate that they cannot afford. And other people who don't look like us are moved into those same developments close to downtown. It's happening right here in Winston-Salem. It's happening in most counties across North Carolina and most states in the United States of America. But I do want to highlight in 2019 at Emmanuel Baptist Church here, when Reverend Dr. John Mendez was pastor, we hosted, and I was kind of at the forefront of doing this in 2019, a Faith and Environmental Justice Summit. And persons like the Reverend Dr. Gerald Durley, who some of you all have heard of, was the keynote speaker. I worked with Dr. Kenneth Olden, who was chief at National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. Talked to him last week, and we're all singing the same song. We're talking about the laws that are in place. We're talking about Justice 40. We're talking about the fact that Michael Regan is, North Carolina A&T graduate, is actually traveling the country talking about the hundreds of millions of dollars that's been poured into states, communities, local government, and other organizations. But guess what? How much of that money is positively impacting communities where people are dying, where people are disproportionately diagnosed with cancer and little treatment, where people actually have very low percentages of healthcare coverage that will underwrite the cost of treating those diagnoses? Let's be really real. The laws are in place, the acts are in place, the clean air, clean water. But right up on Martin Luther King, Smith Dry Cleaners, the owners of that cleaners, they walked away with a mint. They made a ton of money cleaning clothing of people who looked like me because it was convenient. I could walk there. But guess what? When they left the chemical solvents that polluted the water, that damaged the soil. So if they do grow their own vegetables in contaminated soil, guess what they're eating? Contaminated chemicals. So when we talk about PFAS, everybody knows about PFAS now. It's a buzzword, but guess what? The government and other people, corporations, have been PFASing our water, our soil, our air, where our children learn, play, and live. For how many years? What are we gonna do? It's time for some solutions, y'all. I'm ready, and I've been at it for a long time, but I'm really ready, and I want you all to document this. I want you all to write this down if you don't write anything else down. There's a gentleman by the name of Cal Bryant at US EPA, who's the person responsible for North Carolina. Call him. I have some information I will distribute to you that has his email and his phone number on it. Contact Cal Bryant at US EPA Region 4 out of Atlanta, Georgia, and tell him we need, again, it's government, so we don't know how far it's gonna go, but guess what? My mama used to say the squeaky wheel really does get the oil, but at least make certain that it's documented. Contact Cal Bryant. Contact North Carolina DEQ. They have a community mapping system. A lot of the information isn't on the mapping system. Guess why? We don't even know, as community residents, we don't even know about most of the contamination in our communities and what it's doing, why our children are dying disproportionately from asthma. Now, that shouldn't be right. Our children should not be dying from asthma and asthma attacks. But we don't know, so let's tell DEQ we want this documented on the mapping and the tracking. The Maya Hoon, Hoon, is the Title IV and Environmental Justice Coordinator. I have her email and number here. She's no longer there. Okay. Well, they haven't updated their. Golly, that's high turnover in that position. Yeah. In the last 3 years, I think there have been 5 or 6. But the name changed, and the email would change, of course. Thank you, Jasmine. But the phone number did not. So I want you all to contact DEQ and tell them, look, come over here and do some research. Come into our communities. We pay no less taxes than anybody else. It's most of the time at a greater percentage, and that's another subject and presentation on another day. But I want people to be a little proactive. When we don't know what we don't know, but when we do know, let's get out there in the community. I look at this crowd here, and what's always absent is the most impacted population. Why is that? I'll let you all answer that later. But when we talk health disparities and testing and results and all of those things, too often the results are skewed because the people most impacted either don't know or their complaints are ignored, and that does happen. That does happen by doctors and medical professionals, governmental officials. That really does happen. So there are tools, but are those tools available to most impacted populations? Are they available to those persons that live 1 mile east of Bowman Gray Stadium where the methane is being treated? Where 4 people that I know personally on one side of Reynolds Forest Drive, just off Reynolds Park Road, were diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And it wasn't because they weren't going to the doctor. So think about that. Think about those health disparities and those impacts on health and how advocates, we have to get out there and get the information too. And that's why I think I was just so adamant about being involved with the National Black Environmental Justice Network out of Louisiana, being involved with the United Nations COP conferences, and I was a delegate to Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt in November 2022. And I met persons from all over the world who were singing these same songs, talking the same talk. But that some of them were responding differently too. And they don't live in an America that we live in, and the resources are plentiful, but the results are few. And I mean, I'm not saying that racism is just an American thing, but it is an American thing. Let's be real and clear about that. So I just want to kind of briefly state that, Columbus County and Riegelwood, what they're doing. Visit some of these places. Edgecombe County, Coneta, the folks at the CCT, what they're doing. Halifax County, Tillery, Rena, right there in Chapel Hill, in Orange County, what's happening there, and how they're, how in Chapel Hill, less than 5 miles from UNC Chapel Hill's campus, you all know that there's a community of about 86 black families who bought their homes post-slavery, and they built not 1 but 2 landfills adjacent to their property, and how people started to complain because they started noticing things. They started noticing odors. They started noticing that their dogs and pets were dying when they were outside. All of these things are happening and happening a lot. But, again, I mentioned Royal Oaks, the black farmers who, in Brunswick County, the towns adjacent. You all visit the beaches of Brunswick County, but there's a little small community called Royal Oaks, mostly black and brown people, formerly farmers and farm workers. They actually were not afforded municipal water, and I went down and a gentleman poured out his water hose, and what I saw come out of that hose and in his faucet in his house was deplorable. But water was applied, municipal water, and I'm not saying municipal water is always the answer. There are contaminants in a lot of it, but everyone around them were provided water utilities. These families of black former farmers were not. Same thing in Rena. So they finally got sewer services, and it took a lot of fighting, a lot of years of fighting. But let's really deal with some of those things. And I also finally want to let you know that in the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit was held October 24th through 27th, 1991 in Washington, D.C. And they drafted and adopted 17 principles of environmental justice. I have those 17 principles if anyone's interested in reviewing them and looking over them later and seeing, inquiring about what they can do so we can talk solutions and not just talk but implement solutions. I'm done.
Thanks, Veronica. That's wonderful. You've given us several things to talk about and chew on, and I want to first go to the state because we talked about federal. But we live in North Carolina. Supposedly our state should be more responsive to issues like this. Well, what are we finding in North Carolina? Is the state stepping up, and does it think it can make permit decisions based on environmental justice concerns?
Well, better late than never. is I guess, the overarching frame in response to that question. The Cooper administration has taken, as has the Biden administration, more steps to try to advance environmental justice than many of their predecessors. They're still inadequate, and I think one of the biggest concerns is the second part of your question, that the agency that implements, has delegated authority to implement all those environmental laws that Jasmine mentioned, does not seem to acknowledge its obligation to prevent those discriminatory impacts, and indeed has claimed that despite those federal laws, that somehow the state General Assembly has to act to echo those non-discrimination obligations in order for the state to have adequate authority to deny or condition a permit on the basis of discriminatory impact. That is an ongoing legal fight, and it is at the center of many of the permitting disputes that, in the absence of that agency action, in light of the discriminatory effect, often lead to the type of Title VI complaint that Jasmine mentioned. Now, on the positive side, there have been recent efforts. I think most notably, just last fall, Governor Cooper issued the first environmental justice executive order for the state of North Carolina, doing things that you may recall from I mentioned in the federal administration that are a couple decades behind, but along that same track, recognizing this is not just an environmental agency issue. Let's elevate this to all of cabinet agencies, and let's make sure that we have designated point people in each of those agencies. That's actually a different executive order to work on environmental justice. They've also developed or created an environmental justice advisory council comprised of agency personnel, but also advocates and community members to try to develop, among other things, an environmental justice mapping tool to improve upon some of the deficiencies in the community mapping system that Veronica mentioned at DEQ. But I think most importantly, to develop a framework and methodology by which to consider cumulative impacts. And that really goes back to the reality that the communities are rarely, if ever, suffering as a source of a single polluter or a single decision, or even a single pollutant. And so that difficult but critical work to evaluate the full measure of adverse impacts, to then do the work to determine where those disparate or discriminatory impacts are borne by communities of color and low income, indigenous communities, and disabled residents, I think is really important and exciting. But it's new and it's not done. And so that is important work that's ongoing. And I'm hopeful that we will see more action in response to that. So it's not just documenting the problem, but actually trying to solve the problem. And I'm grateful for those recent actions, but it is, I will just emphasize, only the result of a lot of community-based organizations and advocates pushing their government to respond to this reality, that was ever possible. So that's a little bit about what's going on at the state.
And Jasmine, you've been involved in some of these petitions. Could you tell us a little bit about petitions you've been involved with that address North Carolina, please?
Sure. Just trying to figure out where to start. So most of the kind of petitions are, the origin is a permitting activity. And, obviously we don't think the correct permitting decision was made, and therefore we are now challenging it. We've done that, we've taken, there are different avenues to bring different challenges. So I've been a part of both court challenges and then also Title VI administrative challenges, and then other just kind of general policy advocacy. Going the litigation route. In North Carolina, our state judges are elected. Please pay attention to that this November, the election time, because those judges make a lot of decisions that impact your everyday life, probably more so than, I don't know if it's fair to say more so than federal judges, but I would say you have a lot more of an impact or a lot more say-so over, who our state judges are, and their decisions do impact your day-to-day life. And part of that is that now we have a lot of our state judges are also of the mindset that environmental justice concerns should not be a part of permitting decisions, and a lot of whom are also very friendly to industry. Like you mentioned in my intro, a lot of my work is on industrial animal agricultural waste, and that is an industry that is very powerful and has a very sympathetic image. The types of permits that we challenge related to industrial animal agriculture, our opposing side puts up the image of a farmer and says, these are just people who are trying to put farmers out of business, which is absolutely not what we are trying to do. These are industrial operations that are creating pollution on an industrial scale, and that is something that we are fighting in court to try to mitigate. Unfortunately, though, like I mentioned, we have a lot of judges who are very sympathetic to the plight of Smithfield Foods and a lot of large agricultural business companies, and who have, in very recent months sided with them in a lot of our actions and petitions. Once again, that does not mean that we do not continue to fight, because we do believe that we have the word of the law on our side. And we will therefore continue to fight, for what the text of the law calls for, and what honestly the text and also the spirit of the law when these laws were passed, what they were intended to address. And so litigation is hard. This is a tough time in both federal and state courts to be litigating. But we, like I mentioned, we don't just stop because it's hard. Going the Title VI petition route, Ms. Veronica was not exaggerating when she said that those complaints can sit on somebody's desk for years. There are literally petitions that are a decade old that are just waiting at EPA for somebody to even make a jurisdictional decision on, meaning that EPA hasn't decided whether that is a claim that's even worth looking at yet. Like, it is, if you go on their website, it'll just say pending still for petitions that were filed over some 2 decades ago at this point. And so, that is a very long, slow process. Kind of parallel to the litigation we filed back in 2021 about the general permit for industrial animal agriculture. Parallel to that, we filed a Title VI complaint, once again trying to take multiple avenues to get at the same issue. Also recognizing that the remedy that a court can give you versus the remedy that EPA can give you are going to be different, and ideally we would like both. But Title VI is a very slow process. However, ours has moved, relatively speaking, relatively quickly. We've gotten jurisdictional decisions, we've had settlement negotiations, and so we are hopeful in pushing EPA that we will have some sort of settlement agreement within the next couple months. And that petition, and I guess I'll kind of break down the differences in those avenues that we took. So the Title VI petition got at the discriminatory impact from a permitting decision. So basically, in North Carolina, you have to have a permit in order to have a hog farm that has more than 250 head of hog. And so most of those operations receive what's known as a general permit, which is kind of some cookie cutter provisions, and if you can meet these basic provisions, you're given a permit. That permit, back in 2001, they issued a general permit to allow digester systems on hog operations for the creation of biogas, which is basically a cover that you put on top of the hog waste lagoons that will capture the gases, siphon those off to be turned into natural gas, but it still leaves the billions of gallons of liquid and solid hog waste behind that is still going to be sprayed onto fields nearby, completely untreated. So the Title VI petition got at the discriminatory impact of that permitting decision, in that most of those operations are located in communities with a disproportionately high Black population. Meaning, if you compare the populations in those census tracts to the county population, or the county percentage, or the state percentage, you will find a higher percentage of people of color around those hog operations. So the Title VI complaint asked EPA to look at that problem and to go to DEQ and say that in their permitting decisions, they do in fact have to consider the cumulative impacts to those communities. And by cumulative impacts, to get to what Will mentioned before, it's recognizing that not only do those communities have hog operations, they also have pellet mills, some landfills, poultry operators. Like my mind is just going blank because there's so many, and most of them are in eastern North Carolina that we have, not to be too crass, but we have turned into a dumping ground for all the pollution in eastern United States. And so it's asking EPA to tell, DEQ, to tell our state government that they have to look at all those things and not just continue to issue these cookie cutter permits. On the litigation front, once again, because there's no environmental justice statute, we turn to the language of our state statutes that provide the framework for those general permits. And in those statutes, previously, it said that in making decisions about water permits, that the Department of Environmental Quality had to look at the cumulative impacts to water quality. That is what it said. That is what the statute in plain language said. But Smithville argued that that portion of the statute did not apply to poultry or to hog operations, because there's another set of statutes that apply to poultry operations or to hog operations, and therefore, DEQ and the courts need to ignore the water statutes and only pay attention to the hog operation statutes. And our state courts agreed with that. And so I do think that though shows the example of, how we litigate environmental justice issues without an environmental justice statute. Because in that case, we had, our clients and our, affiants look like the people who live in the eastern North Carolina communities that have hog operations. And once again, while we did not have an environmental justice statute to go off of, we did have traditional environmental laws that could be applied to advance environmental justice. Our state judges are elected, and so are the members of our General Assembly. And in the middle of our litigation, as we were literally in appeal, they actually changed the language of the statute to match the argument that Smithfield was making, which was, very unfortunate, and I think actually brings a lot of validity to our claims. If it takes an act of the state legislator to decide who is going to win something, I think that means very clearly that the way things were done before was not right under the law, and that it literally took an express intervention to now make that happen. And so we are still fighting. We are actually in a completely separate but kind of parallel case related to hog pollution. We are waiting on a decision from the North Carolina Supreme Court about an appeal that includes, it's related to Title VI because there's 3 new provisions in the hog animal waste general permit. And those 3 provisions came from a Title VI complaint that was filed and settled close to a decade ago now. And basically Smithfield, or the Farm Bureau, is arguing that the fact that these provisions came from a Title VI process tainted them somehow, and that they therefore shouldn't be included in the general permit. And so we're waiting for a decision from the Supreme Court. We're also waiting for a renewed permit from DEQ about those general permits. And we have a feeling that DEQ is waiting for some more direction from the court before they issue that permit. But that is just my speculation, so I don't. Reporters, please don't quote me on that.
Jasmine, if I could, really quick. Yeah, that was great, but it would be 5 or 6 more Title, was it Title IV and EJ coordinators later, and how many times will the paper turn from one desk to another to another? I mean, the bureaucracy of Title VI complaints. So yes, in our state, Department of Environmental Quality, Title VI, EJ department has had a lot of turnover on the state level. Yes. The same can be said for EPA. So, once again, our Title VI complaints,
are handled and managed and settled by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and they very similarly have quite a bit of turnover. I mean, my understanding is that they're trying to staff up because the Biden administration is making a very express effort to try to settle some of these complaints that have just been laying around for a decade. But I mean, it takes a lot of staffing up and resources to do that. And so, I mean, I think we are now. So we filed that complaint in 2021, and I mean, I think we're on our like third or fourth case manager with EPA, just because of turnover. And I mean, fortunately, there's kind of a team of them, and so the new case manager has been somebody who was already on the team, if that makes sense. So we haven't had to kind of, it doesn't feel like we've had to start over with each one, but nonetheless, I think it demonstrates, how slow the wheels of bureaucracy turn, and kind of a trend of how hard this work is, and like how tough it is for the people in government who are trying to make a difference. Like, I don't think I feel really deeply for those individuals, because I see people who are work for the government and who are genuinely trying, like they want to do better, and it's tough to do that, to keep pushing and keep trying and be constantly, pushed back. So.
I see we have a question in the audience, and I do also want us to not forget one other part of the title, which is the epistemic part, which is how do we, and I think Veronica alluded to this, are we really hearing the folks who are affected? Are their lived experiences reflected in the work we're doing? Is it reflected in the research we're doing? Is it reflected in the laws? And is it reflected in what we're teaching? I heard Veronica basically say, take a phone number and do direct action. That's what we need to do. Thank you, Corey.
I've seen these, but I've never held one. Is it on?
Yeah.
Emily with Clean Air NC, in the spirit of understanding and unpacking all of the jargon, if you will, not to belittle anything that's being said here. I just pulled up on my phone now, there's a ton of articles about the lithium mines, or mining and permitting, and that potentially or definitely moving forward in the Charlotte area. And I've seen it on the news, on NPR, and it's like there's gonna be great jobs, we're gonna have lithium mines, EV all the way next, and now the weather. And I'm like, wait a minute, I don't even know, what goes into permitting for that? What is happening in that space? What communities are being impacted? A friend of mine works for a lithium mining company, and I said, hey, would you want a lithium mine near your house? And he said, no way, never. But it's just glossed over. So I wonder if from a legal standpoint, or just anything, if you could speak to what's happening currently in that space.
So the question's about a lithium mine, kind of on the border of Gaston County, right? And there are relevant environmental laws. I will note that for environmental justice advocacy, one of the key questions is who's impacted and what is their vulnerability. And for that particular operation, the surrounding community looks more like me than it does like Veronica. And I think it's really important to acknowledge the relevance of the demographics and vulnerabilities, not just demographic, it could be pre-existing health conditions, lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to housing. But when we're talking about environmental impacts, what makes them an environmental justice concern is that additional layer of civil rights violation. And so that particular mining operation doesn't pose the same discriminatory or disparate impacts on protected classes, on communities of color, low income. There's not a discriminatory effect that environmental justice would respond to. That does not mean that there are not relevant environmental impacts that exclusively environmental actions could address. But I want to distinguish those two in that specific context. I do think, to the point about the EV transition and just generally extraction, where we often do see environmental justice impacts, even just in that industry, are in production facilities. And in that context, I think it's important to note one of the limitations of state action that I mentioned earlier, where a whole of government effort at the federal level means whole of government. A whole of government as announced at the state level by the chief executive means all the executive agencies that I can control. Notably, that excludes the Department of Labor in the North Carolina governmental structure. Because, to the point about the relevance of elections, the Department of Labor is actually led by an independently elected, currently a Republican individual. Similarly, the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services is led by an independently elected Republican. So those environmental justice efforts that I mentioned under the Cooper administration do not have the same impact on conditions inside a manufacturing plant because the governor cannot, under our structure of law, have the same influence and issue the same directives to the relevant agency that could address and mitigate the problems that are causing discriminatory effect because of, in that context, what we often see as the composition of the workforce. So again, the key is to figure out who is impacted and whether or not that is a discriminatory impact, because that's that overlay of civil rights and environmental law that makes it an environmental justice concern.
And to your question about minerals in the EV transition, I mean, we also have to look outside the United States. Most of those critical minerals are available outside the US. And what we're actually asking to create this new economy is to go into a lot of indigenous areas and previously unmined areas and start mining like crazy. And currently, there are not a lot of protections for the communities who live there from that mining, even if, and some of them do want mining. We have to be clear, not because, just because you're indigenous doesn't mean you don't want to increase your livelihood and make sure your children have a better future than you. So that's important to talk about too. But we talk about that as if it's not environmental justice. We talk about it if that's development law. In our country, we have this weird bifurcation where environment and human rights are in two different worlds. But when we go abroad with our capital, we see it differently, and we treat people differently. We give indigenous people abroad more say than we give our own folks at home say of what happens in their communities. And that's just very bizarre to me as someone who practices a lot abroad. And I see companies do things abroad that are far more protective of what they would do here at home. So that's another thing to think about too, as we talk about, remember Veronica's phone numbers, also remember the phone numbers of the folks you buy things from. If you look on the website and Walmart says we are a really good company who's going to be clear that our supply chains are clean, ask them how they can source North Carolina pork and chicken and claim they're clean, because they can't. And we know that living here. Not only did the North Carolina legislature stop, as we heard Jasmine mention, but when tort suits started to be successful in North Carolina, they stepped in and ended all the tort suits. So we live under a government that's not representative because it's heavily gerrymandered and is oppressive in its actions. And so it's important to say that. And it's oppressive to everybody, but certain of us bear by far the bigger burden. I'm cognizant of time, Melba. Do we need to wrap up? Okay. Thank you all for a wonderful panel. I think we're very lucky to have these folks out on the front lines. I hope we can bring more of the front lines into Wake Forest and have more conversations about how to make sure that what we're thinking about, teaching, and researching reflects these communities instead of just acting upon them. So thank you.